I'll ask you to turn in your Bibles to 2 Kings chapter 13 as we continue what I started a couple months ago with the particular section that we're looking at with the kings of this part of Israel's history. 2 Kings chapter 13. So we've studied in the southern kingdom a man by the name of Jehoash. And I don't want to confuse you tonight because we're going to study someone else tonight by the name of Jehoash, but I'm going to use Scripture's alternate name for him so that we have a clear distinction between the different people. So the one we're studying tonight will be Joash of the northern kingdom, also known as Jehoash. So you're there in 2 Kings chapter 13. And let's go ahead and begin reading verse number 10. 2 Kings 13, verse 10, it says, "In the 37th year of Joash, king of Judah, began Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, to reign over Israel and Samaria, and reigned 16 years. And he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. He departed not from all the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel sin, but he walked therein. And the rest of the acts of Joash, and all that he did, and all his might wherewith he fought against Amaziah, king of Judah, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Israel? And Joash slept with his fathers, and Jeroboam sat upon his throne, and Joash was buried in Samaria with the kings of Israel." So again, not to confuse you, this is a period of history which is ripe with these common names, and we see the two right there that we talked about. You probably in verse 13 saw another name that you recognize. That would be Jeroboam II, as opposed to the other one who's mentioned earlier in the passage, which is Jeroboam I, the one who Scripture says made Israel to sin. So that's the one spoken of in verse 11, versus in verse 13 there it talks about the son of Jehoash, who is also Jeroboam. We'll go into a little bit of the significance of what I think of that in a little bit here. So looking at Jehoash tonight, I want to do a study that I've titled Incomplete Deliverance. Incomplete Deliverance, and I think you'll see as we go through this passage that you'll see that there was that in Israel's history in this part of Jehoash's life as we see it played out. So we've read the verses, and it's a little bit unusual here compared to other times when you have the kings listed. Normally you have the start of that person's life, and it mentions what it mentions. Say, for example, in verse number 10, how it mentions, in verse 11, it mentions the beginnings of his life and this extent of his reign. And then it just jumps you right to the end at verse number 12, or so you think. But it ties all of that together. You get the whole summary in 4 verses right there. And you're given hints about other things that happens that are significant, such as in verse 12, and the really civil war that happened with Amaziah, which is something that I'll actually cover when I talk about Amaziah, it says Amaziah there. When I get to him, we'll talk about what happened in that part of the passage. But tonight we're looking at something a little bit different, which is another significant event in the life of Jehoash here, which takes place throughout the rest of chapter 13. So, one thing mentioned here, I'll just jump right to this, verse 11, talking about Jeroboam. First thing we want to look at tonight, 3 sections that I've divided this study into, and I pulled it basically from verse number 12, the acts of Jehoash. I have trouble saying the names. It's actually very similar to his dad's name. Does anyone have in their families problems with that when you have similar names? You have Jehoahaz and Jehoash. So maybe it was my fault for choosing the alternate version of his name. But part of the reason I did that is because at the beginning and end of the passage, that's the version of his name that they use. So just to be a little bit different, I like being a little bit different too. So Jehoash it is. Verse 11, it talks about he basically just takes after his dad. Because if you look back in the previous verses, in fact, if you go back to verse number 2, it talks about his dad Jehoahaz, who it says of him that he continued to follow in the sins of Jeroboam. We're talking about the original Jeroboam. Again, now not to be confused with the future Jeroboam, which will be mentioned at a later study. But Taking right in his father's footsteps, he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord and departed not from the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. A common theme that you'll see here with a lot of these kings, you'll see this refrain mentioned multiple times. So it says here, he walked in that path. That was the path of his life as he chose to go that direction. He could have chosen to go a different direction, but he decided, it says that he walked. Says that he walked therein in the ways of Jeroboam the son of Nebat. And that was I called it before, the calf cults. He had those golden calves that he had, and he set in different places, Bethel and Dan. And he said, come worship in this place. It's too much of a burden for you to go to Jerusalem to worship, so you're going to come here to worship. And that made all of Israel to sin, as it says there, and it says here, who made Israel sin. And that's been something that's been part of Israel's history now, that's been taken with them. Now, when's the end coming for all that? Actually, we're not too far off in terms of chapters, but we still have a few kings to go through before we get to where there's going to be no more northern kingdom. So how significant was this in his life? The fact that he decided to follow in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. A clue that I gave you was in verse number 13. What did he name his son? Or I should say one of his sons. He probably had other children as well. But what did he name this son that was going to be his successor? Jeroboam. So I guess it meant that much to him to follow in the sins of the original Jeroboam that he decided to name his son Jeroboam also. So, are there things maybe that we have in our lives? Thinking about the decisions that he made to continue to follow in the sins of Jeroboam, do we have things that we cling on to? And this is a thought that I proposed even studying Jehoash, the fact that he continued to follow in this. Do you have those things in your life maybe that you have trouble dealing with, that they just come up from time to time that you struggle with for some reason, somehow, some way? I mean, you believe in the Lord, but you have those sins that you struggle with. Are the things that you hold on to from your past maybe that continue to hold you down spiritually? Maybe you could think of that as a parallel as we think about what happened here with Jehoash and the fact that he also decided to hold on to the sins of the past. Now, let's not be those kinds of people, but let's strive to overcome those things. And that's something that I mentioned when I talked about Jehoash, was being able to overcome the sins of the past. If there's things maybe that have happened generationally in your family, and I talked about anger in my family being something that was passed down, if that's something that, if you make the decision, you can break that cycle. But we see here that Jehoash did not break that cycle. He continued in those sins. Again, we have here in verse 12 mentioned the civil war that happens between the northern and the southern kingdom. And that's actually covered in a future chapter here that we'll look at later. So we see the acts of Jehoash. Most of the time I want to spend tonight is in this next section, talking about the testing of Elisha. Yeah, I know it's been a while since we've talked about Elisha, but we're coming back to him, and for the final time, really, with these studies in the Kings, because this is where Elisha passes off the scene. I'll begin reading again at verse number 14. Now Elisha was fallen sick of his sickness, whereof he died, and Joash the king of Israel came down unto him and wept over his face, and said, O my father, the chariot of Israel, and the horsemen thereof. And Elisha said unto him, Take bow and arrows. And he took unto him bow and arrows. And he said to the king of Israel, Put thine hand upon the bow. And he put his hand upon it, and Elisha put his hands upon the king's hands. And he said, Open the window eastward. And he opened it. Then Elisha said, Shoot. And he shot. And he said, The arrow of the Lord's deliverance, and the arrow of deliverance from Syria, for thou shalt smite the Syrians in Aphek till thou have consumed them. It's interesting to me. Now, it says back in verse number 11 that he did that which is evil in the sight of the Lord. And yet we see him coming before Elisha in this manner here. And really, I would deem somewhat of a respectful manner in the way that he addresses him. Maybe it was a show, I don't know. But if nothing else here, he's acknowledging at least Elisha's significance as a prophet. And the prophets had a ministry to a lot of the different kings and tried to talk to them, going all the way back to, at least with our studies, thinking about Elijah and Ahab. And there are others that I could bring up, but that's one quick one that comes to mind. Now, their relationship was just the opposite. They wanted to have nothing to do with each other, and Ahab was out to kill Elijah, and Elijah, if he saw Ahab, it was just to stick his bony finger in his face. But we see the opposite here with Elisha getting what I think is a respectful address from Jehoash here. You actually find this exact same wording back when Elisha witnesses Elijah being taken from the earth. Back in 2 Kings 2:12, Elisha says these very words here, makes this very same address. He said that of Elijah, but now Jehoash is saying this of Elisha. So again, really, I think he's being respectful here. So he gives him this first sign of things that are to come, and this is to mean something, and he explains it. So the first thing here is that he tells him to take that bow and arrow. And the significance of that, it mentions in verse number 17, that this is the arrow of the Lord's deliverance. It was mentioned earlier, and back in the passage, going back to Jehoahaz, he himself, it was also said that he did that which is evil in the sight of the Lord, but you have what was said in verses 4 and 5, that he besought the Lord, and the Lord hearkened unto him. Because, and it says, for he saw the oppression of Israel because the king of Syria oppressed them. Now, was it really for Jehoahaz's, it's a hard name to say, sorry. Was it for his sake that it was said that he did that for them? Or was it maybe more because of what was said toward the end of verse number 4, because the king of Syria oppressed them? His heart broke for his people because of the situation that we're in. I mean, yes, he did humble himself, so I will give him some credit for that. Now, during the reign of Jehoahaz, you never really see that played out. It's in the life of his son where you see that deliverance played out, where it's mentioned, going to verse 5, the Lord gave Israel a savior so that they went out from under the hand of the Syrians, and the children of Israel dwelt in their tents as beforetime. There was that which was promised based on the prayer of Jehoahaz, make sure I say the right name. And so then we have it at least spoken of here in verse 17, where it says, yes, this is going to happen. You're going to have this deliverance from Syria. It's mentioned, in fact, specifically, if you look at one specific detail in verse 17, for thou shalt smite the Syrians in Aphek. Now it is deliverance, and it's mentioned here, at least in a limited sense, that in Aphek, they will be able to have victory over the Syrians here. Let's talk about the shooting of the arrow here. What might be the symbolism of that? Well, it's said of in those cultures that this kind of firing of an arrow is kind of in a way a declaration of war. That you would use that as a sign to the enemy to say, we're coming for you, so we're going to go out and get you now. So he's kind of putting his hand to the fire here, say, you're going to be fighting back against the Syrians now. And there's this exchange between him and Elisha where he's making the king do this. Now, maybe it was because Elisha was so sick that he himself couldn't do it, but I think he also wanted to have Jehoash have some ownership in this, that he's going to be the one to pull the bow. Because, he's going to be the one who is going to be at charge of this, to lead the armies of Israel in these battles. And then Elisha kind of giving the prophetic approval here by placing his hands on him, saying that this is a sign of God. So you have this that's going to happen, a promise of deliverance that is to come. Let's continue reading in verse number 18. And he said, take the arrows, and he took them, and he said unto the king of Israel, smite upon the ground. And he smote thrice, and stayed. And the man of God was wroth with him, and said, thou shouldest have smitten 5 or 6 times. Then hadst thou smitten Syria till thou hadst consumed them. Whereas now thou shalt smite Syria but thrice. Now, how this played out as far as the smiting of the arrows, there's a couple different thoughts about. Was it just him taking the arrows out of the quiver and just banging them on the ground, or was he shooting the arrows into the ground? I don't know. I'm not really consumed about narrowing down exactly what that means, but he was to be obedient in doing what the prophet asked him, and so he did that to a point. We see that he only did that 3 times, and he was counseled by Elisha here afterwards, saying he should have done it more than that. And that had prophetic significance as well, because that was to mean that they were going to have really ultimate victory over the Syrians had he maybe followed through on that. But because he only did it 3 times, there's the promise there, you're only going to have 3 victories over the Syrians. Some would say that was a lack of faith on his part, maybe thinking about what some of the significance of this was. Can God really give us that victory? Maybe a lack of persistence. Well, maybe 3 times is all we need. Do we think like that sometimes in just whatever our spiritual pursuits might be? Either lack of faith or lack of persistence. Do we not follow through to the extent that maybe we should in certain things, in obeying and serving the Lord? We could have a lot more come out of the things that we do if we really commit ourselves to it and trust the Lord with those things. Now, some would say that the symbolism, why he goes up to the number of 5 or 6, and some say that that's maybe because that's how many arrows were in the quiver, that by emptying the entire quiver and smiting them that many times would be an indication of complete victory. It's something along those lines, but nothing else. He was incomplete in following through on what the prophet had asked there, because now they are only going to have partial victory. One other thing I would note, this is true about many other things when it pertains to the northern kingdom. Usually you're speaking of bad things when you're talking about the northern kingdom. And if you ever talk about good things that pertain to the northern kingdom, there's usually some kind of a bittersweet attachment to that. Like in this case here, they can have victory, but they only have victory up to a certain point. You see these evil kings that maybe have these good moments. I mean, even King Ahab humbled himself at one point, but at the same time, you have the rest of his life, which demonstrated really what his character was, and the same with the rest of these kings. Even Jehoash, we had this moment where he prayed to the Lord, but you have from the mind of God himself, it says there that he did that which was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the overall scope of his life was evil, and the same is said here of Jehoash. Let's continue reading in verses 20 and 21. Just maybe a little side note, although some have attached this in some way to the context of the passage. And Elisha died, and they buried him, and the bands of the Moabites invaded the land at the coming in of the year. And it came to pass that as they were burying a man, that behold, they spied a band of men, and they cast the man into the sepulchre of Elisha. And when the man was let down and touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. Even a dead man can have a ministry in raising people from the dead, which is, I suppose, one way to look at it. But was it really, did Elisha have some mystic power all on his own to be able to do this? Oh, he just had magical bones. Think about all the superstition that happens with other religions where they have these relics or other things that they have where they have some kind of a special spiritual significance which goes beyond what they actually are. And it really ultimately means nothing. But at the same time, they've been assigned that significance. Well, what I see here is the final mark of approval upon Elisha's life from the hand of God to allow this to happen through him. So, because, Elisha was a faithful minister for, people say, up to 60 years of his life that he ministered to the nations of Israel and Judah. And that God would, again, use him in this way. Even his very bones would be used to bring a man from the dead. And how others would tie this to the rest of the context of the passage would be that this was another sign for them to trust the Lord, that they should trust him in his ability to be able to deliver them and to work in their lives. So the final part of the study I want to look at tonight here is these defeats of Syria, beginning in verse number 22. But Hazael, king of Syria, oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz, and the Lord was gracious unto them, and had compassion on them, and had respect unto them because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, neither cast he them from his presence as yet. So Hazael, king of Syria, died, and Ben-Hadad his son reigned in his stead. And Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again out of the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken out of the hand of Jehoahaz his father by war. 3 times did Joash beat him and recovered the cities of Israel. So we see the defeats of Syria here, and again, those 3 times. So there are 3 promises here actually that were fulfilled. Even thinking about the context of the entire chapter, mentions in verse 22 that there was the oppression of Israel during the days of Jehoahaz. If you go back to verses 4 and 5, you see some of that spelled out. Verse 3 for that. The anger of the Lord is kindled against Israel, and he delivered them into the hand of Hazael, king of Syria, and into the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, all their days. And verse 3, it does say there, into the hand of, it says both Hazael and Ben-Hadad. So the meaning of that, I believe, is that during both of their reigns of these 2 Syrian kings, that you would have this oppression taking place. And we have Hazael doing that. You fast forward to verse 24, and you have their change of leadership where Hazael passes away, and Ben-Hadad, his son, comes into his stead. And you have that continuing, and you have that which took place with Jehoash there. So the one promise fulfilled there that was mentioned. The other thing is seeing the Lord's compassion promised in verse number 4. Mentioning Jehoahaz's prayer, the Lord hearkened unto him, for he saw the oppression of Israel because the king of Syria oppressed them. And I gave the thought that God's heart was broken for his people. And I believe verse 23 explains a little bit more of that context. The Lord was gracious unto them and had compassion on them and had respect unto them. And the reason given is because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them, neither cast he them from his presence as yet. And those are 2 important words as well. But the explanation given is because of his covenant. So again, maybe not specifically for the sake of Jehoahaz, but because God wasn't going to break his promise to his people. And the promise given, if you were to look at Exodus 32:13, and this is a place where the children of Israel have also messed up, and Moses is pleading on their behalf. And there Moses is pleading with God, hearkening to this promise, and it uses mentions the same lineage here of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, talking about the promise for them to be in the land and for them to be blessed. So that's what I believe is being referenced here when he's talking about this covenant that God wasn't going to break. And so seeing his people suffer under the sin that they brought upon themselves, he is still going to be long-suffering. And notice at the end of verse 23, neither cast he them from his presence as yet. And I mentioned there was the time coming when God's going to have had enough, and they're going to be carried away into captivity, and that's coming up in a few chapters. But still, God is giving them a chance. Yet this rebellious nation who has continued in the sins of Jeroboam and so many other things and other kings, and yet God is giving them one more chance to be able to turn from their ways. We see his mercy on display there in his long suffering. So the last thing fulfilled, which I've already paid some attention to, is the fact that there was promised that he was going to have 3 victories. Jehoash was going to have 3 victories over the Syrians, and we see that played out here. Verse 25, at the end of the verse, it mentions 3 times did Joash beat him, talking about Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael. He beat him and recovered the cities of Israel. If only it had been just 3. If only he had gone a little bit further, maybe recovered more territory, brought revival to the nation, turned from his ways, and sincerely followed the Lord. But this is what we have. And this is the example that we have to hopefully learn from. incomplete deliverance. Thinking about what I mentioned towards the beginning, talking about the sins of Jeroboam and how they continue to cling to them, and just throwing the thought out there, are there still things that maybe you struggle with, that you just have trouble dealing with, that for whatever reason they're just hard to deal with and hard to give up? How badly do you want that deliverance? I've challenged myself in my own life sometimes about some of the things that I sometimes struggle with, and I almost get frustrated. I do get frustrated with myself sometimes, because I say to myself, why can't I not kick this from my life? And it keeps me coming back to the altar and saying, Lord, first of all, forgive me for what I've done, but second of all, Lord, can I have a different outcome from this point? It seems like the cycle continues sometimes, and maybe you've experienced that in your own life, where you've had that kind of a struggle. We have a time coming up in our church here in this next week where we're going to have the opportunity to be able to do some of that serious business with God, as we have Brother Schwenke coming for leading our revival services. This thought comes to me whenever we have these kinds of evangelistic services or revival meetings, and anything where we have an important speaker who's come to challenge us in some way. Are we just there for the moment? Or are we going to let revival persist in our life? Pastor Walker talks about just getting back to normal, and hoping that would be a thing that would be consistent in our lives, where the Lord would always be able to work powerfully through us. Or are we going to take our 3 victories and go home? I guess the choice is up to us and how we handle this next week. So I pray that you'll choose the latter, and that the Lord indeed will help you, because He will. And so just as I challenge you, I challenge me. Let's take that to heart, and let's have complete victory over the sins in our life.